We're continuing to talk about the root of bitterness, which is found in Hebrews chapter 12, verses 14 through 17. The first two verses of that say, "Strive for peace with everyone, and for the holiness without which no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many become defiled." This text in Hebrews is actually not the first place that we hear of this phrase, the root of bitterness. But rather, it's an Old Testament concept that comes from Deuteronomy chapter 29, verses 17 through 20. And those verses say, "And you have seen their detestable things, their idols of wood and stone, of silver and gold, which were among them. Beware lest there be among you a man or woman, or a clan or tribe whose heart is turning away today from the Lord our God to go and serve the gods of those nations. Beware lest there be among you a root bearing poisonous and bitter fruit. One who, when he hears the word of this sworn covenant, blesses himself in his heart, saying, I shall be safe, though I walk in the stubbornness of my heart. This will lead to the sweeping away of moist and dry alike. The Lord will not be willing to forgive him, but rather the anger of the Lord and his jealousy will smoke against that man, and the curses written in this book will settle upon him, and the Lord will blot out his name from under heaven." Here we see where the author of Hebrews gets his main premise and the phrase the root of bitterness from. And it was applicable for the Israelites in Deuteronomy 29, but there's also a lesson that we can learn from it today as well. And so this phrase, a root bearing poisonous and bitter fruit, is similar to that what we read in Hebrews, a root of bitterness. Those are similar from the Hebrew translation and the Greek translation. However, that's not the only similarity between these two passages. Moses here in Deuteronomy, he was warning the nation of Israel that they had two choices. They could either follow the Lord and obey his commandments and stick to the covenant that they had made with him, or they could go off and they can follow someone or something else, other idols and other gods, and they would lack holiness and they would lack salvation. And Moses, he made it very clear to the people, if there's someone among us who is turning to serve these false gods, there's going to be issues, there's going to be problems. It's going to risk the salvation of those who are committed to the Lord, as well as those who have already left the Lord and are serving false gods. And it's interesting because this premise, it's paralleled in our main text in Hebrews, as we've talked about over the last few weeks. Us as Christians, we can either submit to the Lord, we can rely on the grace of God that He's provided, we can pursue holiness and we can pursue peace with one another, or we can choose bitterness and we can lack holiness, and as a result of that, we can risk not seeing the Lord. It's the same concept here. We can either choose this day to serve the Lord, we can choose this day to hold on to his word and to pursue holiness, or we can serve false gods. And so we see that bitterness, it actually comes down to the idea of idolatry. It comes down to the question of who is my God and who am I serving today? As Moses was reciting this renewed covenant to the people of Israel, the Lord, he told them to tell the people that Israel, they needed to entirely trust the Lord, and they needed to turn away from their idols. There wasn't a halfway point again. And it's interesting because up until this point in the Bible, the Israelites had already multiple times turned to idols. They had already started serving other gods throughout this time. And this oftentimes would happen because the Israelites had a here and now mentality. They were more worried about their physical well-being. They were more worried about what they wanted or what they needed rather than trusting in the provision of the Lord. And they did that despite the numerous times that they had seen the Lord provide for them before. Each new time, it would again be another thing where they felt they were lacking and they needed something more, something different. And one prime example of this is the story of the golden calf. The Israelites, they requested that Aaron make an idol for them out of the gold that they had, because they didn't know what had happened to Moses. Moses, meanwhile, was up on the mountain getting the 10 Commandments. But the people, they got worried. Their leader wasn't there. And so they turned to idolatry as a result. They prioritized the here and the now. They didn't have the foresight to see that Moses was coming back down the mountain and that he had the covenant between God and the Israelites. And the Israelites, they were rebellious. They rejected the Lord and they instead turned to their false gods. They placed these idols in place of where the Lord really should have been. And sometimes idolatry, it's not necessarily as plain as what Israel illustrates for us in a lot of ways. Sometimes it's just a single person who decides to find an idol to replace the Lord. Sometimes it's not a whole nation or a whole church. Sometimes it's just one person from the whole. And this shows us that each person has a choice to either submit to the Lord or to submit to idols. There's a choice to pursue holiness or to lack salvation. And in verse 19, it says that sometimes there is one who thinks that though there is bitterness within his heart, he is secure, as we just read from Deuteronomy. He thinks that he's untouchable in the eyes of God, even though there is a root of bitterness within him, even though he ultimately lacks salvation. He thinks in his own mind and in his own heart that he's safe, when in reality, he has an idol. He's serving something other than the Lord. And again, this is a concept that's echoed in Hebrews. There's an eternal consequence, an eternal risk when we don't pursue holiness. When we think that we're okay, when we convince ourselves that we're saved, we convince ourselves that there's not an idol that we're serving, and we don't look at our hearts truly. The consequence of that is risking not seeing the Lord, risking not knowing the Lord truly. And so as we look at the parallels between Deuteronomy and Hebrews, and we see that we have two choices. We can either serve the Lord or we can serve idols and be bitter as a result. When we see those two options and when we really think about it and really reflect on ourselves, we have to ask the questions, am I allowing bitterness to take root in my heart? Am I serving a false god, or do I really know the one true living God, and do I really serve him and him alone? Because again, there's no middle point. There's no medium between the two. It's one or it's the other. And finally, another question we can ask ourselves is, am I making myself a god? Am I making myself an idol? And am I risking my eternity? When we truly commit to the Lord, when we truly commit to what his word says, when we commit to having a covenant with him, a deep relationship, we know that we will see him. But if we don't have that covenant, if we don't know the Lord truly, and if there's anything that's getting in between us and God, we need to examine our hearts and make sure that we haven't set up an idol for ourselves. Because if we have an idol, we're risking not seeing the Lord. And so as we continue to dive deeper into Deuteronomy 29 next time we're together, we're going to look at how bitterness and division go hand in hand. We'll see you next week.